Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh back in Studio Beltway this weekend next. I will be getting to the condition of former President Biden and his revelation of cancer. Pray for the president's going to be painful at best, and there are big questions about what did everyone know and why weren't we told earlier. I'll come to that later in the show, but I begin today with our friend Haviv Rettig Gur of the Times of Israel, where he's senior correspondent on conflicts. Haviv, where do we find you today?
I'm in Seattle, Washington.
You
Beautiful
know, you're
city.
all over
Truly a
the
beautiful
place
place.
all the time. I'm never sure where I'm going to find you. Thank you for getting up a little bit early then in Seattle, Washington. Habib, we're talking on a day, I didn't set it up this way, but I became a grandfather again today for the seventh time, and I had in my notes to talk to you about,
Congratulations.
well, thank you. But I wanted to talk to you first about the badass grandfather who not your most recent episode of Ask Habib Anything, but two back. Aka Yoram Bar Sinai, architect, kibbutznik, and grandpa, who died at the age of 75 in a gun battle with Hamas terrorists while defending the home of his daughter Ruti in kibbutz Be'eri. Yoram died in that firefight, but not before forcing the Hamas gunmen to give up on the house, saving his daughter and his grandchildren who were inside. May his memory be a blessing. When I heard you say that, I thought, how could I not know that story, Haviv? How is that story not well known?
Hugh, there are hundreds of stories of heroes, of people who just got up and drove their personal private car into the firefight to rescue people, of parents and grandparents who, with some military background, some not, who came to the rescue of their kids, of members of a kibbutz who ran to where they thought the gunmen were. People ran toward the firefight, and there are hundreds of those stories, and we will never know some of them because they died, and no camera in the street saw it. No, there's no footage from Hamas about that particular moment. So there are heroes that we will never hear about. And just to say, heroes are produced in moments of failure. You don't, if a military operation is perfectly planned and executed well, there are no heroes coming out of it. Heroes come when things fall apart. Everything fell apart on October 7, and so there are tremendous numbers of heroes.
Well, I must say, grandfather Yoram Bar Sinai, that's pretty amazing. He's 75 years old. Grandparents serve when they're younger and they are served when they're older. He's right in the sweet spot being 75. But to hold off a half dozen or more Hamas terrorists from a front door with your grandchildren behind you, that's a movie. It's not believable. I may his memory be a blessing. How do people sponsor editions of Ask Haviv Anything that way?
Thank you for asking. You email me at Haviv, Haviv, at askhavivanything.com. Or maybe it's .org. I really should know when asked. But
Yeah.
and we'll talk to you about it. And it's not very expensive. And it's a beautiful thing, by the way, that sponsors have asked for, dedicating episodes to the memory of people who died on October 7th. That wasn't our idea. Sponsors asked for it again and again and again. And Yoram was, he's an architect who designed many of the public buildings in the area. He also was a man who traveled throughout Africa as an advisor on how to build better cities and better buildings, and brought his expertise to development in the third world. It's yeah, a lot of these people on these kibbutzim are the best kinds of people.
Well, that's pretty remarkable. Haviv, in the course of the last few Ask Haviv Anything, I had a number of questions. First of all, you have alluded to the years you spent in Wisconsin. How many years did you spend in Wisconsin?
4 years. My high school years were in Nicolay High School, Glendale, Wisconsin. Go Knights!
Do you root for the Wisconsin Big Red? Are you a University of Wisconsin college football fan, or did that stay behind in the United States?
No, after high school, I went back to Israel to the Army, so I don't have any affiliation or affection for Wisconsin
Okay.
college teams, but I was a very big Packers fan, and I
Oh,
remain a Packers fan, even though I have
oh.
been gone 25 years.
Well, we may have to end this relationship at some point then, Haviv, because I'm a
I'm
Browns
sorry.
fan,
I'll
and
die on this hill.
as much success as you've had, we've had no success. Here's what I want to ask you about primarily. I don't know if you have listened to Dan Senor's State of World Jewry speech yet, but in it is the proposition that Israel's fine and American Jews are not. What do you make of that proposition?
So first of all, I admire Dan, and I think he's a very profound and serious person, and he knows American Jewry better than I do. Um, and the deep social level, at levels of social cohesion and community and general happiness of human life, Israel is much stronger than a lot of American society, which is, I mean, there's Americans are talking about this constantly. I'm not introducing anything new to the conversation, but there's this kind of disintegration of family, of the corner church, of community. And in that sense, I think that, that's driving that kind of breakdown in a lot of social structures is driving a radicalization. The social media algorithms are driving radicalization. The fact that Americans used to live next to people who voted the opposite way from them and today almost never do. And so all they know is people who agree with them, and that also radicalizes. So I think America is going through socially, even if economically it's a massive success story and will continue to be for generations, socially it's going through a breakdown. And I share his concern. And Jews are facing some of that whirlwind because a lot of it is expressed as anti-Semitism, from the Candace Owens and Ian Carroll being interviewed by Joe Rogan to talk about how Jews rape children, and just classic old insane anti-Semitism is coming to the fore because of this social crisis.
Well, what Dan's argument was the solution for American Jewry is immersion of their children in Jewish experience, whether Jewish day school or Jewish camp during the summer. And I get that. That's just sort of the Roman Catholic culture of my youth. You were immersed in it. You couldn't not get it out of you. You couldn't get it out of you if you tried, if you were immersed in it as a young person. But I'm wondering about the APAC strategy and if you have thoughts on that, which was I talked about it with current President Trump last week about how Israel's influence in America's Congress has declined. The anti Israel power has increased. And he kind of marveled how that had happened in his lifetime, how Israel had gone from being, you didn't mess with Israel in Congress, to you don't even think twice about messing for Israel because that'll get you in trouble. To what do you attribute that?
I think this is not a place where I'm an expert. I think that, however, I think that a lot of the discourse around Israel among young people has changed very fundamentally because a lot of the ideological debates have changed fundamentally. Some of it, I think, frankly, Israel's fault. We've just been in a terrible war for 19 months, a kind of war that is necessarily fought in an urban environment. At the very least, 10,000 civilians died in Mosul in the America-Iraq Kurdish war there to root out ISIS. But everybody understood what ISIS was, and everybody understood that there was an end game here that was going to be a good end game, and that America would be there to help rebuild also. It wasn't about destruction. And Israeli leaders in the last 19 months have spoken like absolute morons and have right now, for 19 months, there has not been starvation in Gaza, and the claims of starvation in Gaza by some organizations that we should be able to trust. But when it comes to political, when it comes to their politics, it overwhelms their professionalism, and we simply can't trust them. They have claimed there's starvation in Gaza. There were a few small pockets, and we've talked about this in the past, and specific operations for a limited time where there really were supply problems, but there has not been starvation in Gaza. And now, because it's a whole new strategy to actually uproot Hamas, to deny Hamas control of aid, which they were using as leverage over the civilian population, there actually is going to be hunger in Gaza pretty soon. And now the Israelis, yesterday, Netanyahu gave the order to begin to allow aid in, and they're building out a new aid mechanism that is meant to bypass Hamas. But talk about it, say it, talk about how Gazans won't starve. Talk publicly, openly. If Netanyahu asks to go on CNN or puts out a TikTok video, that's going to go viral. Everyone will see it. He can speak to the world. The Israeli government can say, We're not going to allow people to go hungry in Gaza. We're also not going to allow Hamas to continue to control a civilian population that is now desperate to get rid of Hamas. We're seeing unbelievably brave protests against Hamas. Whole movements are being born in Gaza, putting out public statements against Hamas. And we're not going to allow Hamas to continue to control that population through control of aid. And Hamas is willing to have them all starve to death, whereas we are not. Say those words. Now, functionally, that's what's going to happen. Gazans are not going to starve to death. The Israelis are going to bring in supplies. But this idea that you have to look tough and say insane things and allow the far right to talk about ethnic cleansing is an Israeli self-own. And Israel, when you're going to be that incompetent, you deserve the blowback. So both, there's a cultural thing happening in America. There's this progressive discourse and a little bit of the woke right and a little bit of anti-Semitism mixed in. And there's also an Israeli incompetence in managing this moment. And those two things, I think, have fundamentally changed the environment in the United States. And I like AIPAC.
Well,
I think they're right. I think they're good. I've met a lot of
there's
left-wingers at AIPAC, a lot of right-wingers at AIPAC. But Israel has to also play ball.
Yeah, there's this post 10/7 America about which you're absolutely on target, but the sewer lids came off on 10/8 in America, and all of this venomous bile burbled up about which we were unaware. And the question then became, and I was listening when Dan talked the State of the World Jewry speech that he gave at the 92nd Street Y this past week. It's a remarkable speech, but it's about what Jews have to do for Jews. And I kept listening to it. I'm not Jewish. I'm a friend of Israel for a variety of reasons, none of them eschatological, by the way, for the benefit of people out there. I know some people are like that, but that's not me. I'm amazed that AIPAC doesn't spend more time making friends among Gentiles in the West and not spending all of its time on organizing its Jewish colleagues and compatriots. Are you?
I can't speak for AIPAC. I'm not a spokesman of AIPAC, but there's something I know about them. There are a lot of American Jewish organizations, and some of them call themselves, defense organizations, and they deal with anti-Semitism, and they try to defend Jews and protect Jews. They often suffer from terrible mission creep. In other words, a donor shows up and says, "Hey, I want you to go to campuses to help Jewish kids on campus. I want you to go to Jewish schools and help teach kids at schools. And I want you to do all these things." And if a donor is found to fund it, they'll go do that thing. And they end up doing 40 different things and not one of them well. And there are other organizations that have a very different strategy, like AIPAC, where they're a little bit like the Air Force. They only do one thing. And if they do it well, everybody succeeds. And if they don't do it well because they have mission creep and they also went to campuses and they also went to other places, then they actually lose the ability to do the one thing we need from them. So AIPAC is an organization that will say no to a donor who wants them to go off mission. They're very, very mission focused. Leaving aside Jews, leaving aside Israel, in general, organizations should look like AIPAC and not like organizations that will do anything any donor asks them to do. So I don't know. I think that AIPAC is not a place where I bring any complaints to. The rest of the Jewish organized world really is very confused about this moment. They're still trying to put out press releases about anti-Semitism when 50% of the kids get all their news on TikTok, and there are no real serious organized Jewish efforts on TikTok. So I think the Jews have discovered they don't have the institutions for this moment.
When you find someone like Douglas Murray, who is your age and your generation and wildly effective in making the case for Israel as a Gentile to other Gentiles, where do you think he came from? How do you reverse engineer Douglas Murray to engineer more Douglas Murrays in the future?
I actually think we can't find or make Douglas Murrays. Douglas has been fighting a fight on much larger issues affecting Western civilization, on big questions of immigration and integration. He's not, as I understand him, I apologize to him for trying to represent him, but as I understand him, he's not opposed to immigration, but it has to be integrated immigration. And mass immigration that doesn't integrate is a huge problem. And so he's concerned about a lot of much larger issues. And in that much larger sort of fight, as he sees it, for the future of the character of Western civilization and liberalism and democracy, democracy. He sees Israel as one front in that war, not necessarily because he thinks the Israelis are like amazing and perfect in every way. I've heard him criticize Israel, but because Israel's enemies are very much the enemies of Western civilization and liberalism and modernity and all the good things that we're supposed to like. And so he loves Israel, but he's not Israel. In other words, he's fighting a different war in which Israel fits in that larger war that he
Boy,
perceives.
I'm so glad you said that. That was the answer I was fishing for. I think our problem in the
Well,
United States is that
we're
we've
into
lost a grasp of Western civilization. And that I've been teaching con law for 30 years, and the first lecture is always the same. You got here, you have your individual story to my few dozen law students, but there's a collective story, and you've got to know the Jews, the Greeks, the Romans, the Brits, and the Americans to understand your story. And the Jews started, and that's where Western civilization gets started, along with Athens. And I don't think that the modern generation knows Western civilization, so it can't appreciate the contribution of the Jews. What do you make of my theory?
I, intellectually, in terms of the intellectual history of the West, I agree 100%. The difference between the Jews' one God and some other people's three gods or 1,000 gods isn't numerical. It's categorical. In other words, one God is infinite God. One God
Yes.
is an all-encompassing God. And one God also is a universalizing idea for humanity. In other words, Jewish law learns from the first two chapters of Genesis, which are two different versions of the creation story, that all people are equal. All people are equal because all are the children of God, to the point where when the genocidal army of Pharaoh is drowning in the sea after the crossing of the sea by the Israelites, and they start singing because they have been rescued from this genocidal army coming, A, to murder them, B, to take them back into slavery. The angels, the Talmud says, are starting to sing alongside the Jews for this great miracle that God created. And God turns to the angels and says, how can you sing when my children are drowning in the sea? In other words, the genocidal army chasing the Jews to return them to slavery are also his children. So there's this idea of universality that a single God allows for, that I think the Jews introduced into world history. And that absolutely is the beginning, certainly, of what would become a Western morality, like Christian morality, etc. There was a Jewish philosopher. We're really off the topics we usually cover. There's a Jewish philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig who talked about who actually was going to convert to Christianity and then chose not to, and actually became one of the most significant Jewish thinkers of Judaism in the 20th century. But he never lost his love for Christianity, and he talked about how Judaism was the candle and Christianity was the light. And that is how this idea of universalist morality spread through the world. And so there is this absolutely origin story of some of the profound ideas of Western civilization in Judaism. I don't think you can get away from it.
So in the 1960s, and I will connect this back up with the here and now in Gaza. In the 1960s, the study of American civilization went down hard in America's universities, not long followed thereafter in secondary schools, except for sectarian schools of any sort, where a story of civilization was told that usually would begin with Genesis and with the Greeks and Socrates, and then it would build from there. If you lose all that and you just start doing TikTok, you're going to be susceptible to venom. And venom gets into younger people more quickly, and you end up with Butler Library at Columbia campus a year and a half after 10/7 being occupied by idiots, by morons. And they're not stupid, they're just ignorant of everything. And the only way out of this, and Dan didn't talk about this, is really in America. I don't know, it's not the case for it, but in America, it's to reintroduce education about how we got here, how Western civilization is the key, and how Israel is the key to Western civilization, one of two keys, Athens being, along with Jerusalem, the beginning. So, with that said, what would Israel do to try and, you had this discussion about international law, and I'm 100% with you. I took international law from Jacob Stein in 1883, and we laughed about it then. It's everybody's idea about what ought to be done with no enforcement mechanisms, and now it's even being perversely put to use. I thought your takedown of the idea of international law was complete and satisfactory to me, and I know international lawyers hate it. But what do we do to rebuild some kind of sense of what is good, true, and right in every situation? You know, categorical imperative stuff.
I'm a big optimist. I have a funny feeling, I have a sneaking suspicion that what is good is also what works. And what is true, align, or what is more true, nobody knows the perfect truth, but the more true aligns better with reality and will make you more successful in real life. And so reality will test us all. Progressive ideas, some progressive ideas are great. I mean, look, I'm Israeli on healthcare. I'm to the left of Bernie Sanders. Okay, so just when I say progressive ideas, I mean the specific ideas that are controversial and under debate, right? Um, Progressive ideas shattered not because conservatives defeated them in some formal debate. They shattered because they met reality and crashed. And everywhere they defunded the police was a disaster for minorities. And everywhere, the blue states are just poorly run because they're so busy wasting money on things that don't work. So reality gets a say. And the debate is not about what morally should be true. The debate is also about how does reality work and how do we do the best within that reality. So if you want to legislate war out of existence, you will be ignored because war is still going to happen in human civilization, and you will have legislated yourself out of the conversation. If you want war to be harm to civilians to be mitigated in war, you can legislate that you are allowed to win a war, but you have to, in every way that doesn't prevent you from winning the war, mitigate civilian harm. That is actually what international law says and is supposed to say. So, for example, if Hamas operates in a hospital, that hospital is a target of war. Hospitals are protected, but they're not immune. And Hamas committed the terrible war crime of entering that hospital operationally. That is true, and it is simple truth, and every international lawyer will admit it. And if the International Committee of the Red Cross pretends that is not the case, that Hamas can operate out of a hospital and then they're immune to Israeli attack, then that is a fiction. And it is a fiction that does not exist in the Geneva Conventions and is intended to prevent Israel from winning. It is intended to give Hamas that leg up. If international law will be a weapon of war, it will be ignored, it will be destroyed, it will be demolished. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants against the Israeli former defense minister and prime minister. He did it in a procedure and a process that is totally unique compared to other warrants issued by the ICC. He did it quickly. He did it without consulting with the Israelis. And we now know from Wall Street Journal reporting and many others that he did it. He expedited those warrants without getting Israeli feedback, even, which is a preliminary stage of issuing such warrants, in order to cover for the fact that there are multiple serious sexual assault allegations against him that have now caused him to be suspended from his position. Well, if you're the Israelis and you can't measure law on whether the person committed the crime. Okay, let's imagine the Israelis are criminals. International law is still crashing because of its politicized prejudice against Israel. And in other words, a court, just because it's looking at a guy who actually robbed a bank and stands before the court, if a guy robs a bank, stands before the court, and all the court cares about is his race, law is still crashing. It's not, law must be fair even if it's dealing with a criminal, especially if it's dealing with a criminal. We have to be able to trust law to know that the criminal actually is a criminal and not that the court is just doing politics. International law inherently can only do politics. The ICC can open investigations if the Security Council tells them to. What's the Security Council? It's a bunch of governments. The International Court of Justice can sit and decide on Israel's legitimacy, Israel's future, because the General Assembly tells them to. Well, the Muslims outnumber the Jews in the General Assembly 50-1. International law is politics pretending, masquerading as morality. And that's a tragedy because we need real international law. We need an ICC prosecutor who is not just running scared from his sexual assault accusations. We need an ICJ case, the ICJ to sit in judgment over a potential genocide complaint that isn't from a government like South Africa that was chummy with Assad while he murdered 600,000 Sunnis. International law is so utterly hypocritical that it's a tragedy. And people think that this is going after Israel and going to undermine Israel. It's going to undermine international law. So there's a real problem here. a profound problem. And it doesn't go away if you actually think the Israelis are criminal. That a criminal might
No,
actually
it
have
doesn't.
committed the crime doesn't mean a court doesn't have to be a court.
The ICC in Khan would be a cartoon were it not tragic, because Khan figures out the world's going to come down on him for sexual abuse of women, and so he blames the Jews. It would be a cartoon were it not tragic. And South Africa throws in because they're in the business of dispossessing white farmers out of their land, and so they're going to blame the Jews. It's really back to back to back to back to back repeats of what we've seen from early medieval times forward, and maybe even earlier than that, when Jews became the scapegoat. Now I want to come up to the current day, Haviv. The president was in the Middle East last week. How did you assess his visit in terms of, was it good for Israel?
That's an interesting question. I think it was a smashing success for America. Trump kind of shunted aside all of the ideologies and the complexities and the analyses that American foreign policy had used to try and be very clever in the Middle East, and just said, no, we're just here to do business. You're you, we're us. I don't understand you. I don't need to understand you. You want to buy stuff? Please come and buy stuff. That was a very good move, and he came back with something like $3.4 trillion in offers of investment. I think a couple of trillion in actual actionable investment that will happen during his term. It was an incredible success story. Israel was left out. He actually gave a speech in Saudi Arabia laying out his understanding, his policies. It was actually a good speech, praising America's allies, promising that Iran is the enemy, and actually needing to, saying that he was going to crack down on Iran, that it can't have a nuclear program, etc. But he didn't mention Israel. I think with one side mention of October 7, he didn't mention Israel at all. And so Israel was very much shunted aside. My argument has been, Hugh, you've been interviewing me since almost October 7, or for many, many times in the last 19 months. And my complaint about Netanyahu has always been the same. He doesn't initiate, he doesn't present clear visions, he doesn't have the ability to hold our allies to our side by telling them it'll be better down the road. Now the Trump administration appears to have exactly the same understanding of Netanyahu that I have had all these 19 months, which is, he won't go to Israel on his first visit because he's not going to get anything out of it. He's going to stand there. There's going to be a press release. Netanyahu will make it look fancy for him, but he's not actually going to say, this is the Gaza conclusion. This is how we end it. This is the humanitarian aid I'm sending in. Thank you, Mr. President, for being here to support us, but also to enable us to do this, and also maybe to pressure us to do it. There's no win for Trump. So why would he be with the Israelis right now? The Israelis have to present a vision for Gaza after the war. They have to present a path to that victory. It has to be on the table. Is it going to be a painful path? Is it going to be a 1.5 year long path? That would be more acceptable than just literally not presenting anything, which is the current Israeli leadership's strategy. So the fact that he brought the Gulf states closer to America is good for Israel. The fact that he doubled down and tripled down on opposition to an Iranian nuke in every way, at every turn, in every speech, is good for Israel. The fact that America is now coming to the Middle East with a serious business mindset rather than all this kind of strange moralizing that always crashes and burns is good for Israel. And it's time for Israel to get with the program, present a vision, and join this new American process in the Middle East. I think Trump wants Israel at his side. Israel's just politically struggling to be a coherent player and actor that says what it wants.
Yeah, he asserted to me last week on this program, Donald Trump, that he is the best president ever for Israel. Better than anyone. That would mean better than Truman, better than Nixon in 73, better than anyone. And there are familiar refrains that go along with the chorus. And we know what those are, including moving the embassy to Jerusalem and the annexation of the Golan Heights, the resumption of weapons, the green light to Netanyahu if Netanyahu wants to go into Gaza and do whatever he wants. And I assume eventually a green light in Iran. But you noted the speech the next day at the Gulf Cooperating Council. He said, number one, Iran can't have a nuke and they have to abandon terrorism. That was an add-on. Number two, the Palestinian leaderships have to stop embracing rape, torture, and murder. That was unusually blunt. And then number three, the hostages must be released as a stepping stone to peace, which implies steps. Step number one, hostages out. Step number two, peace. So I thought it was wonderful, with the exception of I put an asterisk next to Syria, which I wanted to ask you about because the guy's a terrorist. And I guess we can forgive and forget, but he probably killed Americans or wanted to at least. What did you make about that part of the trip?
Before I talk about Giuliani and Syria, I want to just say Trump really has had Israel's back. The big question is Iran. Israel's not in the room on Iran just because Trump doesn't trust Netanyahu's judgment anymore. So what I said is really desperate. I mean, we really need our leadership to get with the program. I'm not saying Netanyahu should step down or all this kind of conversation after October 7 that Israelis are having, or the protesters. I'm saying get with the program, be serious, get in the room, answer questions. You won't answer questions. You might have to lose the far right. If it's going to get the hostages out, you're going to get the center left to join your coalition for that purpose. Take brave steps. An Israeli leader who refuses to take brave steps is not going to get the job done. That's just the most important thing to say right now. On Syria, I basically think, I hate to be in such agreement with Trump. I hate to sound partisan, but I try not to sound partisan on any side. But I think he's right. I think Trump is right. Giuliani is in a position in which he is basically now a proxy of the Turks. He doesn't want to be a proxy of the Turks, and he's taken steps to come out from under the Turkish thumb, including, for example, asking Putin to keep Russian troops in Syria, just to have another power that he can leverage against the Turks. He wants peace with the Israelis. He wants peace with the Israelis to remove a Turkish excuse. He wants peace with the Israelis to not have the Israelis also, stepping in and interfering in Syria. He's keeping the Iranians out by force. I mean, there are battles with Hezbollah fighters in the Bekaa Valley to keep the Iranian smuggling of weapons to Hezbollah and trying to rebuild Hezbollah from happening, because for his own internal theological reasons, he hates Shiism. It's not about Israel, but nevertheless, there is nothing worse than Assad. There can't be anything worse than Assad. And Giuliani, you're absolutely right. He's former Al-Qaeda, maybe still Al-Qaeda in his heart. I don't know. But he's absolutely anti-American, absolutely jihadi, absolutely murderous people, no question. Now he's in a position where he's trying to build something that is very much in Israel's favor, very much in America's favor, and it's the Middle East. You don't get to pick them. This is not a bad moment for Israel and the United States, and I think Trump embracing him is pushing back on the Turks, is pushing back on some others, stabilizing a Syria that is anti-Iran. I think it's a good thing.
Okay, so that brings us to our two last subjects, Iran and Gaza. Whether or not Donald Trump okays an attack on Tehran, I assume they're not going to turn over their enriched uranium. I assume they're not going to destroy their centrifuges. He told me those centrifuges would be destroyed nicely or destroyed viciously. Do you think Israel's going to have to do that by themselves? And when do they do that, if they're going to do that?
In the Kennedy administration, America began to seriously embrace Israel. It did not seriously embrace Israel because of AIPAC or because of American Jewish love for Israel or because of Christian sentiment of President Kennedy. It embraced Israel. In fact, there was a lot of religious sentiment toward Israel in the Truman administration. And in the 48 war, Truman put an arms embargo on Israel at its most desperate and vulnerable moment. The Americans embraced Israel when Israel got nukes. And allegedly, according to foreign sources, is how we say it in Israel. I don't actually know anything about the Israeli nuclear program, except that Colin Powell once said that Israel has 200 nukes, and everybody kind of knows that
Right.
Israel has nukes. When Israel got nukes, America said, we don't want these people feeling afraid. We don't want these people going crazy. We don't want these people who feel very vulnerable, surrounded by all these enemies, to drop a nuke anywhere by accident. So we hold them close, we make them feel safe, but also that closeness to them allows us to also see what they're doing, control a little bit what they're doing, prevent anything from spiraling out of control. Israel was a wounded tiger, and that brought American support and aid and protection. We are now in an age where sentiment no longer matters to the Americans. It's about business, it's about American interests. That's healthy. I'm not opposed to that. That's a good thing. And it also makes America more reliable, because you can calculate going forward America's interests. You can't calculate going forward America's moral sentiments from one administration to another. But more importantly, it means that Israel also has an interest in now shaping American interests in the Middle East. So you think you can sideline us? Well, we should be able to go it alone. I actually think that it has become, because of the sidelining of Israel, which I, as we said, blame on the Israeli leadership for not understanding this moment. I think Israel now has to have a much, much more independent path from the United States. We're too dependent. It's not even about the money. If the foreign aid dries up, the $4 billion that we anyway have to spend in America's defense industry, 100% of it, that's not the dependence. We have money. We are higher GDP per capita than Britain. What we don't have is airplanes. In other words, the F-35s, if we need spare parts for them, we literally depend on America for that. So we need to take some independence and some distance from America for that. America will appreciate us more, protect us more, coordinate with us more if it's afraid that we could go it alone. So I am coming around to the view that we have to be able to go it alone to make it A, useful to America to hold us close, and B, we might actually have to get things done on our own. Olmert destroyed the Syrian Assad's nuclear program. Imagine the Syrian civil war, from 2011, if Assad had nukes. Well, Assad's nuclear program was destroyed 5 years earlier by a decision of Prime Minister Olmert. And in 1981, the Iraqi nuclear program was destroyed by a decision of Begin. We have to be able to destroy the Iranian nuclear program. We have to be able to do so, and it might take troops on the ground in Iran. It might be a horrific and devastating and painful. There might be thousands of missiles raining down on Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv might be set on fire. If we have that ability and we have that courage and we have that capability, we might not have to use it. We might also have American support at that moment. If we don't, if all we do is stand hand in hand begging for American help, we're not going to get that help, and Iran is going to get a nuke. So we need to
I think if you
strike
ask
out
for
on our own path.
permission, I think if you ask for permission, it's a coin flip whether you get it. If you go, we are obliged to go with you, simply because we can't afford to have Israel fail in that mission. But the last time you talked to us about what you were thinking about doing, it ended up in the New York Times. So I really don't know if I were Israel that I would trust the Trump administration, because there's a leak in there somewhere, and you can't have your battle plans put on the front page of the New York Times. So I think if you go, we will follow. At least there will be an enormous push to do that. Now in Gaza, I'd like you to explain to me what you think the battle plan is. To me, it seems like that the IDF is going to attempt to carve Gaza into 4 or 5 fingers with roads between them, controlling access back and forth, and meanwhile clearing, if not leveling, Khan Yunis and Gaza City, and making Gaza half of the size it once was, and the rest of it a parking lot. What do you think?
A long time ago, year and a half ago, on Dan Senor's excellent podcast, I made a suggestion that got me a lot of ridicule from even friends, which was that Israel should open a humanitarian zone within Israel, in the Negev, in the desert adjacent to Gaza, move the civilians there, have them taken care of properly, by the way, by Israeli Arabs who are also Palestinians and also know Hebrew and also know Palestinian Arabic and also are citizens and also would de-radicalize the people they meet from Gaza. And then Israel will have a free hand to go after Hamas in Gaza. There's a 500-kilometer tunnel network in a 25-kilometer territory. It is an astonishing feat. It is the biggest thing Palestinians have ever built, and its sole purpose is to carry out wars in which Gaza is destroyed on the altar of destroying Israel. That tunnel network has to be demolished. And there are thousands and thousands of entrances in all of Gaza's cities. So this is a demolition war. And the civilians have to be out of the way and taken proper care of, and in a way that Israel can control, so it can also weed out the Hamas fighters from within those civilian populations. That was my suggestion many months ago, and nobody laughs at that kind of a suggestion now, because now we have exactly that problem, but without all the advantages that would have given us. And I think, by the way, if an Ariel Sharon was in charge of Israel, or some of these really initiative-taking and courageous people, then that's the kind of strategy you would have seen. So yes, now we have to divide what the army is planning on doing. This is there's a perception in the Israeli leadership that this is the last go, that the war has to come to an end. That's a demand from the Trump administration. It's a demand from the whole world. It's a demand from Israelis
Right.
who are sick of serving, Israelis, etc. They're going to divide Gaza into sections, and they're going to go systematically and destroy those tunnel entrances everywhere they find them, which means every building is potentially demolishable. And they're going to, just yesterday or a couple of days ago, they bombed this enormous strategic, like very, very long, 5-10 kilometer, I forget what it was, tunnel. They're going to go systematically through Gaza, and it's going to be that systematic demolition. Everywhere there are pockets of Hamas, they will engage them in a serious way. It's the last big pressure on what is basically 20% of what Hamas used to be, massively depleted. It hasn't had an ability to resupply over the Egyptian border basically since the spring of last year. And this is it. This is when Hamas is brought low finally and permanently. And part of the blockade of aid that now has created a potential hunger situation going forward, I mean, in the next week or two, that's why Israel is now rushing aid into Gaza, even if it might fall into Hamas's hands, because the system to avoid it falling into Hamas's hands hasn't been, will only be fully established in a week or two. Is that it has that blockade was also meant to deplete supplies that Israel believes were controlled by Hamas as leverage over the population. So this is the final powerful push. What we get done now, we get done. What we don't get done, we won't get done. And the goal is to move civilians out of harm's way, smash Hamas to the point where it no longer is capable of ruling Gaza. And then there are potential futures. I have to say one last thing about Trump's visit. The leak from Trump's visit about Gaza from Trump administration officials has been that Trump and the Saudis and the Emiratis are working on on a Gazan day after plan, in which Hamas is disarmed, its leadership is exiled, and there's a massive rebuilding program in Gaza and policing, and the Arab world moves in. The Emiratis, the Saudis move in and do the rebuilding. Hugh, that's Israel's victory conditions. What the Trump administration has agreed to with the Arab Gulf states, everyone except Qatar, which still supports Hamas, is Israel's victory conditions. All Israel has to do is say, yes, please. And that's not something, and give us 2 weeks for the final demolition of the last bits of Hamas we can get to, and then say yes, please. That's not something that Netanyahu is doing, and I think that's causing a lot of frustration with Trump, because he's delivering literally what Israeli officials a year ago said would be what victory looks like. So Trump is very much on our side, and we need to get with the program and get serious strategy in place. This military offensive would be very effective if it was part of a vision for the rebuilding and a better future for Gaza.
So, Aviv, last question. My grandchild, born today, lives as long as my grandfather. He will be alive in 2125. What do you expect the Middle East to look like in 2125?
I am often accused of being an optimist. I think that the kind of Islam, the strains of Islam that have done so much harm, so much horrific harm to the Middle East, in Syria and Yemen, and what Hamas is, the Muslim Brothers, this horrific war in Libya. Libya is now basically two countries. The strain of Islam that is radically anti-Western, anti-modernity, anti-science, this kind of puritanicalism that goes back to the original generations and everybody, and the oppression of women and mismanagement of economy, that Islam has been so discredited in the Arab world. And hatred of Israel over Gaza in the Arab world doesn't really make it go away. In other words, there's also horror at Hamas, not the fighting against Israel, but what it has done to Gaza and what it represents, and the fact that it can't actually offer any better future for Palestinians of any kind, only mass destruction. And that Islam is on its way out. And you saw that in the Gulf, and you see that with the Emirates and the Saudis, who de-radicalized over the last 20 years out of disgust at what that strain of Islam has become. I think the future is better, not worse, in the Middle East among Muslims. Incidentally, I'll say this, and somebody will share it in 15 years and laugh at me for being silly. There are radicalization processes underway in European Muslim communities that are going in the opposite direction. In other words, Islam in the Middle East is moderating, modernizing, looking for a better future, whereas Islam in some of the minority communities in the West is actually radicalizing for reasons having to do with identity and some of the ideologies of the West themselves. So I think the Middle East future is good. And I think Israel
Are Jews
can
in
manage
Europe
its
coming
position
to
in that
Israel
world.
in greater numbers? Are Jews in Europe, the last remaining Jews in Europe, coming to Israel?
Yes, especially from places where there are large Muslim communities that produce terrorism. Not that the Muslim community produces terrorism, but large Muslim communities contain minorities within them that are large by virtue of the community being large, that does actually produce. French Jews have faced just an unending wave of attacks and anti-Semitic assaults and actual outright terror attacks over the last 15 years, and are coming to Israel in unprecedented numbers. And it is a signal of France's future that France had better get a handle on, and it's an absolute tragedy. And we're happy to have them come home, but nevertheless, yes, there is an increase in the Jews essentially fleeing Europe.
Well, Haviv, I thank you for your extra time. I tell everyone his podcast is Ask Haviv Anything. If you want to sponsor a broadcast, send him a note, Haviv at askhavivanything.org. I'm betting it's .org. If it's .com, you can try that if it bounces back. Haviv at askhavivanything.org or .com. I think it's .org. Thank you, Haviv, for your time. I appreciate very much. Talk to you again in a couple of months.